Dobro jutro. Good morning. It's a bit early for some of us here, but I think we need all the time that we have allotted to us in the panel because we are talking about one of the top, most interesting topics today, which is the role of China in the Western Balkans. I have a fantastic panel, some of which I've interviewed for stories about China and the Balkans, some of whom I've had the pleasure of meeting this morning, finally, after a long time. So all the way at the end, we have Agnes Zunomar, who's the head of research group at the Group on Development Economics at the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. Well, it's Hungarian Academy of Sciences. If you don't know, it's been through some changes, but that was the title. Anastas Vangeli, the doctoral researcher at the Graduate School for Social Research at the Polish Academy of Sciences. He's written a dissertation called Symbolic Power and Principal Diffusion through the Belt and Road Initiative, so I'm looking forward to unpacking that. Hanna Semanic is a research fellow at the Central European University Center for European Neighborhood Studies, so we have a strong Budapest repping on this panel. And Jacob Mardell is a researcher and journalist who's been traveling throughout Eurasia to explore the Belt and Road Initiative projects. He has a really interesting blog. I encourage you to check it out. Lots of sort of reported narrative detail about on the ground, where are the projects, in the middle of a tiny village in Macedonia, North Macedonia, trying to meet Chinese workers on a stalled highway project. So maybe we can start with you, Jacob, closest to me. You were recently here in Serbia in April doing some research for this project. Can you tell us what were your impressions?
Thank you to the organizers for a fascinating couple of days and for inviting me to this panel. Like I said, I was last here in April, and I came pretty much straight from Berlin, where attitudes towards China are very, very different to what they are here. Here I was struck by how pro-China everyone was, sort of from the top down to the bottom of society. Like I met a guy on the street that sort of didn't have a job, feeding a family of 3. He was like quite resentful, anti-Vucic, anti-Brussels, but he was very pro-Beijing. He thought China was going to save the Serbian economy, which I thought was interesting. And also I think Chinese interest in Serbia is pretty huge, probably more than anywhere else, any non-EU country this side of the Caspian Sea, which is interesting. Reasons for that probably, I think the Belt and Road ties together sort of various policy goals which predate the launch of the initiative in 2013, one of which is trying to sort of push Chinese companies up this global value chain. And I think Serbia is probably a good place to do that because Chinese companies can sort of acclimatize to European standards on things while also sort of still tie these concessional loans to contracts to Chinese companies, which, as we saw in Hungary, they can't do. And on the Serbian side, it just makes sense, I think. Serbia needs infrastructure, China has the money for infrastructure, and it has this sort of package which doesn't demand too much institutional capacity to process. And maybe there's some other perks too, which we'll probably talk about. I just wanted to quickly talk about consequences. I think the first thing to bear in mind with regards to consequences is that consequences vary a great deal depending on what country you're talking about. I kind of see Belt and Road as this sort of amoral force that can bring out the very best and the very worst of a country's political instincts. Where there's corruption, it fuels corruption. Where there's like a sensible project pipeline, it can fuel sustainable development. So 2 consequences which are probably kind of obvious, just decreased EU leverage, the decreased leverage of traditional financial partners, just in the sense that when Montenegro goes to the EBRD and says, can I have this big road? And they say, no, you can have smaller roads. I would have assumed in the past maybe Montenegro would have had to build that smaller road, but now they can go to China and build a big road. And then the flip side of that would be sort of increased Chinese leverage, increased political influence. And what I'd really like to sort of discover from this panel, from this session, would be sort of what this means for Serbia in practice, just because I feel like in Southeast Asia, for example, Beijing's strategic goals might more heavily undermine national interests in a way they don't here, because we're far away from Beijing. I think maybe it's more a case of like towing Beijing's line on things like Xinjiang, which I find personally awful, but why should Serbia necessarily care? Just in the sense that when we talk about Chinese influence here, we're often, it seems, talking about what Brussels thinks and why Brussels doesn't like it, which makes sense because China's EU's systemic rival, but why should Serbia care? So that's what I'd like to find out.
Thank you very much. Hannah, let's talk a little bit more about the region. Where is China choosing to invest, and is it looking for partners where it will be able to bring out the best or the worst, as Jacob said, and kind of where's the divergence there? Thanks.
Thank you very much for the question. Thank you very much for the organizers for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here at this big event. I'm very happy to share with you some of the findings that I've done with my colleagues working on a recent publication on external actors in the Western Balkans, and China is certainly one of them. Well, China entered the region, and there is no doubt about it. It came in without a lot of fuss, but it is to stay there for a while, in my opinion. Well, if you take a look at all of the Western Balkan countries, which are not part of the European Union just yet, China is investing heavily, and it is cross-sectoral investments, usually ranging from infrastructure, energy, telecommunication, IT sectors, etc. And they're very much focused on big infrastructural projects in the Western Balkans as opposed to core projects in some of the bigger member states. The people and the population is very much divided on the issue whether these are good or not so great investments in the region, based on several big examples throughout the region, and Jacob mentioned just one of them. This is big infrastructure investment in Montenegro. I would say that the long-term consequences can be very harmful for the countries, although the media and the regular people don't really know much about this information, and you have only experts and analysts and economists who can, based on the facts and a little bit of more digging, say that, well, maybe in the long run this is not going to be very good for us. I mean, maybe in the later set of questions I can go into some more details, but I would say this is the general overview of the situation in the region.
Thank you so much. Anastas, you are, as someone described you last night, the hipster of this topic. You were interested before it was cool. You've been studying it now for almost a decade, I think. So what is your perception of the Belt and Road Initiative and how it's evolved as this region and perhaps its European perspective are not... that the region has not gotten as close to Europe as maybe people would have expected 10 years ago?
Well, thank you very much. Thanks to the organizer for having me and for organizing such a splendid event, and it's a pleasure to be on the panel. Thanks, Valerie, for the question. I mean, as you mentioned, yeah, I've been studying Belt and Road for a while, and what I've noticed as a personal kind of thing, the more I read, the more I learn, the more I listen on the Belt and Road, the more I write on the Belt and Road, the harder it is for me to talk about it, especially in general terms. But I'll try to bring in just a very few quick points from my own research and my experience dealing with the ideational / normative / symbolic aspects of Belt and Road, its ideological foundations and ramifications. The easy way for me to put it is to first drop like 3 antitheses, what BRI is not, and then a couple of points especially concerning BRI in Europe and the Balkans. So in general, I think it's not very useful to always describe BRI as an infrastructure investment plan. What is more useful is to see it as a broader vision of connective development in which infrastructure and all these projects play a particular role. It's very much founded on the Chinese experience, which is normatively very different than the European / the liberal / the neoliberal model of development. And I think one of the core ideas here is, of course, where infrastructure comes into place is if you build a road first and you're going to develop, it's basically this idea that the state should invest boldly, take gambles, and develop the economy. Then that comes the vision of corridor-like development, boosting the integration of local economies in global supply chains, which I think is kind of a, especially coming to the Balkans, for instance, is kind of a discourse that is challenging. A lot of people have not been thinking in those terms. They have followed a different path of thinking, and this is one potential source of friction. I also think there is kind of the recent geopolitical developments, the fear from China has kind of overestimated its, let's say, strategic cunning side, especially when it comes to the financial aspects of Belt and Road. I for sure could claim that Belt and Road is not a supremacy plan. So, I mean, as research has shown, let's say by the Rhodium Group and others, this whole debt trap narrative, and we can discuss about it later on, is not really the most useful to explain what is happening with the Belt and Road project. I think the more useful way to think about it is that China, with all these projects, actually is making a huge bet. It's a huge gamble for China itself. But how it is justified, at least in the discourse among Chinese policymakers, is that they really believe in firm interdependence. And interdependence is what China, how China got to this position since 1978. It embedded itself in global trade and investment networks. And as a major exporter, it has thrived only when others have thrived. So if it wants to sell products, others should be able to buy it. And this is, of course, this defines why it's not altruism what drives China. It's very much self-interest, but it's a different type of self-interest than commonly assumed. And Belt and Road is certainly not aimed at completely subverting or overthrowing the liberal order, but in a way, in practice, it's creating some sort of hybrid. In the sense, while it is a promotion of a state-led, government-led development, really markets and companies have a major role in it, and even Western companies. You go back to China, you discuss how some of the core ideas of the Belt and Road have emerged. It's actually Western companies doing business. German car manufacturers Northeast China sending their intermediary and final goods to Europe by train and so on. And on the institutional level, while Belt and Road is building up new institutions, Belt and Road specific, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and so on, it's very much a vision that is being pushed also through the old established institutions, the UN and others. So it's a very kind of in between, a very specific kind of beast, if you want to put it that way. And just two quick points on Belt and Road in Europe and the Balkans. I mean, Belt and Road really facilitates the emergence of China as a European power. This is a process that started with the global financial crisis, when China emerged as one of the major actors, at least, or it was considered as a major actor in helping solving the sovereign debt crisis, contributing a huge financial input in Europe. Anyway, the Belt and Road is, and I'd like to borrow Jacob's concept of enhancement drug. It kind of pushes forward the already ongoing dynamics in Europe. So, for instance, you have a lot of intra-European competition, be it competition with China, competition between each other. Speaking about the Balkans, you go to, let's say, Netherlands, they say, oh, if this corridor down to Piraeus to Budapest functions, what this means for Rotterdam, that means less goods for us, right? You go to 16+1, 17+1 meetings, you have different countries kind of elbowing each other. We want this kind of cooperation with China. Maybe our country is the strategic location for Chinese investment, and so on. And of course, you have the bifurcation of EU policy on China, which of course didn't start with Belt and Road, but Belt and Road is kind of amplifying it. Europeans cannot speak with one voice because there is a lot of national economic interest. Pretty familiar story, not related only to China, of course. And finally, BRI has emerged as a very solid, I would say, Plan B or even Plan C or Plan D for many in Europe, but it's certainly never, even in Serbia, which we can agree is probably the poster child of Belt and Road Cooperation, it's never like the primary option. It's never the main option, not yet, at least. However, as a solid Plan B or Plan C, BRI really feeds off of the failure of Plan A or whatever is the main game in town. And one reason, we know what's the main game in town, right? And one major factor for this is the big, let's say, narrative power and the capacity to kind of inspire the imagination. Because if you really see what global actors are doing, it's only Belt and Road that is really like a global vision. You know, you have the US with America First, you have whatever is going on in Europe, which is not emanating a mobilizing narrative. Russia certainly doesn't have the potential, so Turkey in the region, not really. And the Belt and Road can be a vision that can be considered to have many holes, weaknesses, but it is a vision, and it is certainly a story that's oriented to the future and progress and so on. And this is what kind of drives other actors. And so far, it's a solid Plan B.
Thank you so much. So let's come back and see then if this is the Plan B and C for the Balkan regions who are knocking at the door of Europe and struggling to find an entryway, to continue with Mr. Macron's door and house analogy. How is it seen from the CEE countries, the Visegrad 4 countries, which are in Europe, which have also at one point had a very strong relationship with China, which is now changing in the past year especially? Thanks, Agnes.
Well, I'm also happy to be here, and thank you for the invitation. And I was also afraid that my position here is somehow to represent the EU member state CE point of view, which is a difficult task, to be honest, since even if we are just narrowing our focus to the Visegrad 4, I cannot say that we have a common ground in many cases, but we don't have a common ground on China as well. So there are different type of approaches towards China within the Visegrad 4, within those 4 countries, and even the motivations for this different approach is different. So it sounds, I know, pretty complex. If we would like to differentiate between the countries, like putting them into groups as dragon slayers and panda huggers, because this is the usual distinction between countries in terms of their relationship towards China, then Hungary is definitely the most pro-Chinese country, the biggest panda hugger in the Visegrad region, because it started its relationship building with China pretty early, in the early 2000s, before our EU accession actually. And it is still really committed in politically as well as economically towards China. And not just the current government, but I have to say that all the previous governments did the same in this regard. The case of Poland is really interesting because they have changed a lot. They started to be interested in China in the past 10 years several times, but in the past few years it has changed a lot. There was a huge shift. And in the past few years, especially after the Huawei scandal, and especially after some kind of a push from the US towards not to be that friendly with China, they decided to be rather unfriendly, and in several senses, especially on the economic agenda, they are following quite similar rhetoric to President Trump's rhetoric. In the case of Czechia, the situation is even more complex, since there the president is very pro-Chinese and pro-Russian, while the prime minister is rather skeptical, at least based on his previous examples, previous experiences as a businessman, when he tried to make some business deals in China, but it was unsuccessful. And the case of the Slovaks is really interesting because there are not so many investment at all, so at least for them it is possible to be rather neutral. In this case, I mean, in terms of the relationship to China. But even those approaches to China are different, even the way they perceive the Belt and Road is different. But I think that maybe the best example is the Hungarian example, which is very supportive from the early beginning, and still we don't have that many positive outcomes from this relationship as we should have based on this commitment.
Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to unpacking a bit more of that. I guess we can come back around to Jacob. Since you've been traveling all around, we've heard that Serbia is kind of a poster child for enthusiasm. I spoke to someone last night who was saying that actually, amazingly, in the media, if you look at the media in the last year or so, there's so many positive statements about China that at some point it seems that China, views on China among the ordinary people are as favorable or sometimes even more than even for Russia. I don't know if you've seen that, but in your experience in all of these different countries, do you have a sense of whether increased friendliness and openness of the population is leads to more funding, more projects, more, better relations?
This is an interesting question. I was thinking about it a couple of days ago, and I don't really know. My initial sort of sense was that sort of bootlicking flattery doesn't necessarily lead to sort of investment, because the Chinese aren't coming here because they like to hear how nice they are. They're coming here to make money. So, but on the other hand, I think on the flight from Bishkek, I was sitting next to a guy from Beijing. He's coming over here to sort of scout out whether he might be able to set up a hotel chain. And he was talking about Sino-Serbian friendship, how nice people were, this kind of thing. So I think maybe on that micro level, it might make a difference. Like in Kyrgyzstan, there's a lot of xenophobia, and you don't actually see, despite sort of China holding like at least half of the country's debt and being very economically invested, you don't see as big a Chinese presence as you do in Belgrade. So I guess the answer would be, maybe a little bit.
Do you want to say anything more? Do you want to say anything more? No, okay. Hanna, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned the debt trap. I was in Montenegro in April doing a story about the highway, and one of the things that really surprised me was the terms of the contract that the Montenegrin government agreed to. You know, for instance, the fact that the Chinese government, if they defaulted on their debt in 20 years, could access some parts of their non-military territory, that it would be, if there was a dispute in the contract, it would be adjudicated in Beijing. You know, the percentage of Chinese workers and Chinese infrastructure and materials that would be brought in to do the project. And, you know, what struck me was it's you know, is it a problem? Are the Chinese a problem, or is it the problem of the governments which are agreeing to these things? Like, can we, you know, everyone's afraid of China, but it's actually, I mean, the government signed that contract. So can you assess that throughout the region?
That's a very good question, and it's $1 million question, you know. I think it's a little bit of both. As you said, I mean, China is there to offer something under their conditions, and of course they're not here to be great saviors of Montenegrin or Western Balkan markets. I mean, they're there at the end of the day to, you know, go into their into their own favor. This is exactly what happened to Montenegro, and this is happening in other Western Balkan countries. The country really agreed to take the loan of 800 billion euros for this project, which is a huge step for a very small country in terms of size and population as Montenegro. So this is number one. Number two, that the conditions are quite unfavorable, meaning that the country will have to start repaying this debt in 2021, which is in less than 2 years. And then the third one, as you said, for these big infrastructural projects, it's always the courts in China itself that will resolve any kind of disputes in the end. And this will mainly be dealing with not paying back the loan. On the other hand, you have the Montenegrin government saying that this will be a very successful project in the end. This will meet the country needs. However, there were two feasibility studies, one in 2006 and one in 2010, 2012, done by an American and French consortium, saying that this road or this highway would be very unfeasible. It won't have enough vehicles, first of all, to kind of have it paid off in the end. Then this is the question, as Anastas said. I mean, yes, China is there not as an altruist, but it's there to meet their own needs. And if you have a counterpart, on the other hand, that is willing to go for, I mean, why not? So I think there is a little bit of on both sides. But yeah, it's essentially Western Balkan governments who sign these deals, and then, let's see. Hopefully, this turns out to be a good one. But as far as the analysts and experts project, this could be a serious debt trap for Montenegro, which essentially won't be able to pay off the loan.
Are there any other examples as egregious as this one in the region?
Actually, in March this year, Bosnia has also signed a big, actually took a great loan from China to build one of the power plants in the city of Tuzla in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And this is a huge project. This is one of the greatest projects for Bosnia in the post-war era, and this is a very similar case to the Montenegrin one, where experts really warn about the long-term consequences. On the other hand, in Bosnia, and as this is my country, there is not much independent media who would warn about these cases. The government media is really not talking about this, and regular people really only see these big projects coming in without knowing what is really behind.
Sorry to keep badgering you about this. I was also in Tuzla recently looking into this story, and my question is, I mean, is there a credible alternative? I mean, who else is coming with offers of money, if not for coal, then for renewable energy sources or some form of, I mean, is part of the problem that there's just not enough external or other donors, investors willing to entertain such projects, and people are forced into China's arms, or is it a question of?
This is very interesting, especially in the case of Bosnia. China is one of those investors or external powers, call them as you want, who don't really ask about, ethnic affiliation, religious belonging, whether it's this or that entity, especially when it comes to Bosnia. If they find a partner they can work with, they don't care about anything else. And this is not the case, for example, with Russia or Turkey, who really, especially in Bosnia, deal and invest in projects along ethnic and entity lines. China is one of those actors, and I think this is why I keep repeating, they're really business oriented. China is obviously filling a gap that has been created in the Western Balkans, and this is mainly the gap that the European Union and the US are not fulfilling at the moment because of different issues and challenges that are out there. But this is not an excuse. This cannot be an excuse for letting other actors play with and in the region.
Thank you. Thanks. Anastasia, I read this morning in my newspaper that growth in China is hitting a 30-year low. You mentioned that China is doing best when it's interdependent, that it thrives when other people are thriving. how is this slowed economic growth, the global situation with the trade war in the U.S., do you see that having consequences for some of the Belt and Road Initiative projects in this region?
Well, thank you. That's one of the hot topics, right? The slowdown in China. I think it could go both ways. There is a strong argument that with the U.S.-China trade war, actually the Belt and Road gets a boost because China needs to diversify, needs to do all that trade that it cannot do with the U.S. with the other countries, not just in Europe. I mean, primarily Asia, Latin America, and so on. In that sense, let's say the preliminary deal between Trump and Xi, and then the announcements of a new deal, may be a bad decision, a bad news for the Belt and Road, and in particular for China-Europe trade, because once China commits to export so much or to import so much rather from the U.S., it limits. It cannot import more from this part of the world and from Europe. In general, the slowdown in China, it is yet to be seen how it plays out. There is certainly some adaptation to the new conditions. There is in theory, of course, growth is a very unpredictable thing. It can go up and down, but there is a general rule that you cannot sustain a huge growth over so long. So much of this slowdown has been expected, and I think Chinese planners have been adapting to it. But it's already reflected in terms of the Belt and Road. There is less investments than, let's say, a few years ago. This is also a result of what I mentioned. China doesn't have endless amount of money to give out, so and that's why I think this is a very significant weakness of the debt trade narrative. After a while, China is also concerned of getting these projects to work. If they put up money, I mean, even if it's a loan, they really, want to make most out of it. And if you have an underperforming project in several places, you kind of rethink the strategy. So if you look at Xi Jinping's speech at the Belt and Road Forum earlier this year, he announced that the approach is changing. It's going to be more meticulous. It's going to be more kind of hands-on, technical. He compared it to the different kind of painting styles in Chinese culture. He said, if the first 5 years were more kind of general freestyle painting, this next few years will be more technical, more spot-on style of painting. So it of course, it's yet to be seen, but it has an effect. It's very interesting also to see how the debates in China are unfolding. We have to remember that big part of China is still not yet developed that much. As, let's say, the east coast of China is booming, and if you see Shanghai, Guangzhou, you see those places, that those are really like global development. They're global centers, but you see the inside of China, the central China, western China, it's still not there. And many people in China are like, wait, why do we give out so much money to, let's say, the Balkan countries or elsewhere? Because we have problems here. So that is also part of the debate. I mean, you have to remember that China is not, again, this monolith. There is debates inside. So there are some dynamics over there, both at the very practical level and the discourse level.
Thank you. Agnes, what do you think that the Balkan countries, the Western Balkan 6, other members of the Belt and Road, should learn from the experience of Hungary's relationship with China or Croatia's relationship with China? I mean, the big Chinese investments inside of the EU have been a bit slower. Maybe you can talk a bit more about why the Belgrade-Budapest highway has been delayed and what lessons we should draw from that in terms of collaboration. Thanks.
Well, the main message would be that you have to be patient, I would say, because it takes time. It takes very much time. And I think that especially those economies already part of the EU, part of the global value chains of the EU, especially German global value chains, get used to the fact that if a business has been done, then it is done within a relatively short period of time. So just sign the contract and the operations or the constructions will start within a month or two. But it is absolutely not the case when dealing with Chinese companies. The Chinese, you have to know the Chinese habits, you have to know the Chinese business culture, because without it, you will be completely misled by them. Not because they want to mislead you, but because they don't like to say no, for example. So they never say no. They say something which the Central and Eastern European countries might understand as a yes, although it was not even intended to be a yes. And it is possible that, as it happened in the case of my country, for example, that it is already published in several newspapers that a new investment will going to take place within 1 year, a new car factory from China or a citric acid factory from China will be built, and it never happened. And it is sometimes somehow undermines the credibility of even of the governments, the local governments of Central and Eastern Europe. So I think that the majority of the government have to be really cautious when dealing with China, since they have much more time. They don't have to think in 5-year terms or 4-year terms. They have enough time to wait for the right time to make this or that investment. In addition, they have different type of targets when investing in different type of countries of Europe. For example, they would like to acquire high technology firms in Western Europe. They would like to make greenfield projects in the EU member states of the Central and Eastern European region, and they tend to bring more low added value type of investment or infrastructural projects to the Western Balkans. Although for the development of the Western Balkan countries, it would be more useful to have, for example, more innovative or high added value investments. And it is not that easy to negotiate with the Chinese when you are a small country in the Western Balkans talking to one of the biggest economy of the world. And I would only just add one thing to what Anastas just has been said, to your questions regarding the slowdown of the economy. I've been dealing with China for almost 2 decades, which means that I'm the oldest in the panel, by the way. And I have been reading several articles on the imminent slowdown of the economy, on the imminent collapse of the Chinese economy, and still it never happened. And I would have to add that this slowdown means 6%, which is the double of the size of the majority of the emerging Central and Eastern European economies, like the Hungarian economy, which are even growing at a faster pace than the Western European ones. So I think that they will be able to develop in the near future.
Thank you. Yes, I should have mentioned that. I could abuse my position as moderator a bit more and continue to ask my questions, but I see that there's a lot of interest in this room, and I think it might be good to open it up to questions. If we have somebody with a microphone, and if we have any hands. Okay, I see one hand here in the front. Let's just wait. Another one. Okay, we can take these 2 questions, and then... So the first question is here, in the front, and another question there. And of course, please introduce yourself.
Hi, yeah, we planned it, so it would be really easy to pass the mic across. I'm Rebecca Fabrizio, I'm Deputy Head of Mission at the British Embassy here, and I think I've been working on China issues as well for a long time, more than 2 decades. So I've got quite a lot of questions, but I'll try to narrow it down. None of you have talked about 17+1 at all, of which is of course directed by China with a group of European countries who don't coordinate amongst themselves. They don't really have a mechanism to do that. So the 17+1 has grown in scope quite a lot, and China really dictates the agenda. And it's really interesting here because Serbia appears to be the sort of star of this group. So I'd be really interested to hear what you think about that and how it can undermine European Union leverage, particularly amongst those EU member states that are involved, and also accession countries as well. I'm also really interested in what Anastas said about the narrative power. It's true that the European Union, of course, is a set of legal institutions and not particularly exciting, and they've always had a lot of challenges with narrative power, I think it's fair to say. And China has prioritized this, I think, under Xi Jinping with this idea of telling their story, this notion that we have to go and talk about our history and so on. But the narrative power of the Chinese Communist Party is not necessarily stellar either. Their documents and things that they put out and so on can be quite dull as well. So how is it that China manages to create such a narrative power that's so influential? So I think I'll leave it at that. I've got about 10 more questions, but I don't want to dominate.
Did you have a question? Okay.
Thank you very much. I'm Dubravka Negre. I'm heading European Investment Bank Regional Office for the Western Balkans. I had a question in relation to the foreign policy and the Western Balkans, to some extent, in my view, take decisions on investments in relation to their foreign policy goals. It could be the case for Serbia and the whole issue of a relationship with Kosovo and Belgrade, Pristina, and the fact that China has not recognized the independence of Kosovo. How much do you think that plays into account when choosing strategic partners? And the second question is, how much, in your opinion, there is or there is not the presence of the subsidies towards the Chinese companies from the Chinese state? Because this is really what puts an unequal and to some extent unfair play when it comes to the competition. If there is one at the first place, but even when there is a competition, if you do have companies competing on public tenders, if one is subsidized by a state and another, both being private, supposedly, or even if, in case of public companies from China, if competing with private companies from the rest of the world, how that, in your view, plays into that game of fair and open competition, even when there is one. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was one of the questions I had in my back pocket, so I'm very glad that you asked it. And we have one last question here, and then we'll go to the panel. And then we'll come back for another round. So save up your questions.
Nemanja Starović, BFP alumnus. Just one short question for the panel. Maybe Anastas or Hannah can answer. Hannah already mentioned that it seems that there is a certain gap here in the Balkans that China is trying to fill. But it seems to me that this gap is even wider. So when we look at all the transport strategies of the European Union, it seems that the Brussels is only supporting interconnections between the Central and Eastern European states and Germany along the east to west axis. And it's only that China is supporting a connection between those states themselves on the north to south. So wouldn't it be wiser for Brussels, if it really wants to counter this Chinese influence, to give more support to interconnections between Central European states from Baltics to the Aegean? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so who wants? We have 4 questions. 17 plus 1, the narrative power, subsidies, and East-West infrastructural funds. Should we start with Agnes? Okay.
We can start with 16 plus 1 or 17 plus 1 question. So I think that when the whole idea came out from the Chinese mind, I would rather say that they didn't want to undermine the EU's unity. I think that, as far as I know, and I've talked to several Chinese officials and Chinese experts, the background rationale was even to somehow develop the relationship between China and the EU. So in the beginning, they truly believed that it would even enhance the cooperation between the two entities. And maybe it was a huge failure, and maybe it was a disappointment for the Chinese as well, but they decided to stick to this idea. But I would like to emphasize, as you have also mentioned it, that there are no cooperation between those 16 or 17 countries. So when we are talking about the 17 plus 1 cooperation, we are talking about 17 bilateral cooperation. So we have summits each year, but we never have pre-summits among the 17 leaders or the 16 leaders, although we should have, I think, because otherwise we won't be able to come up with common ideas. Otherwise we won't be able to fight against this competitiveness we have in the region mentioned by, for example, Anastas, because we do have, even in the Visegrad 4, we have huge competing interests, and that undermines our unity even bigger than the case of how the Chinese approaches us. So I think that from the EU's perspective, it can be seen as something undermining or even fragmenting the EU's unity. But I think that in the reality, the EU is fragmented in itself quite heavily. And this is, well, if this would be the only problem, I think that we would be able to overcome that. But since there are quite a lot of other problems fragmenting the EU, I think that this is just one from the I don't know, tens or thousands of other problems. And the other thing is that we are not really using this opportunity, those meetings, to be proactive and have our own ideas and offer them to the Chinese. We are just sitting there listening to the Chinese ideas. Then we have a year to work on based on the different type of guidelines we have after those summits. But if you just make an audit of what has been happened so far, not so much, I have to say. And those investments, for example, because from the Western media, the main critics are touching upon the issue of investments and infrastructural projects, but I think that those are not really connected to the 16 or the 17+1. Even without the 16 or 17+1, we would have more and more, or an increasing amount of Chinese investments, because they have started it already in the early 2000s. So it was a process that has already been going on when the 16+1 initiative has started. As for the subsidies, I absolutely agree that there are subsidies, and not only in the case of the state-owned enterprises, but in the case of the private companies as well. The biggest private company which is here in the region in almost all of the countries is Huawei, which is a private company indeed, but which is also a national champion company of China, which means that they have strong connections. I wouldn't say that those connections are that strong as they have been, for example, 10 or 15 years ago, but still they are connected to the state. They try to somehow follow the guidelines of the Chinese state. They have a so-called catalog, for example, that tries to list those favored regions, favored countries, and favored industries where investments of Chinese companies are preferred. This is an authoritarian regime, so I think that we shouldn't be surprised that those catalogs exist. But still, it can be a problem. Although those companies, several of them, submitted application to several tenders in the European Union, and they were not always successful. I would say that usually they are not successful. When they were successful, for example, almost 10 years ago in Poland, to build a highway, it was the Kowek case, the company Kowek case, it was a failure. So it turned out, even for the Chinese themselves, that based on those standards, based on those practices they use in China, they won't be successful enough in Europe. And maybe they've learned something from them, and now they try to use a little more, I don't know, more high-level techniques in order to be successful. Maybe the idea of coming with infrastructure projects of the region is also one possible solution for covering this failure in the past. But still, the subsidy will be there definitely in the future as well. And it is not easy to overcome that. This is the role of the local governments to somehow balance this situation.
Thanks so much. Anastas, do you want to?
The first question was 16, 17+1, right? Agnes really captured some of the points greatly. I just want to add 2 points. First, the establishment of 16+1 back then, as it was called, it was an attempt of China to actually acknowledge the reality of Europe. It's two-speed Europe, right? It's two tracks. We all know what the 16 have in common. They have a post-socialist trajectory. You add Greece now, it's not post-socialist country, but it's crisis-struck kind of dependent capitalist country. And at the same time, these were countries which really had very little cooperation with China before. I mean, even today, if you see more than 90% of the economic flows between Europe and China take place actually between Western Europe and China. Post-socialist Europe accounts for less than 10% or so. This was some of the rationale on the Chinese side. And they have tried to engage the EU, and they have tried to Europeanize the concept, but of course it's Europe. If Brussels is not consulted, if Brussels is not as equal on the table, it will be always seen as a problem. On the other hand, it was also an acknowledgement of something else, and this feeds into what I said before, that in dealing with Europeans, you actually really need to deal with national governments. And if you see what's the tendency now, Merkel is already announcing that the big EU-China summit under the German presidency will be sort of a 28+1. All the national governments will be represented there. So there has been some merit into that approach, if you ask me. The narrative power, I think there are two reasons why it is successful in the region here and other regions, and why it is comparatively more successful here than, let's say, in other parts of Europe. One is that the Belt and Road in particular is a very context-specific, like very targeted sort of narrative. It targets countries that are still developing countries, that are post-colonial, post-socialist, troubled by crisis. It is, and the whole idea of connective development. I mean, you cannot sell the idea of a new highway to a country that has already established network. Like, you go to Germany, you talk about highways. I mean, what you're talking about. But in the Balkans, it's pretty appealing. And another reason is that China really has a clean record, because it was not active before in that realm. It was not active in the region. It just comes now. And on the other hand, it comes with a really stellar record of economic development of the past 40 years. So in that sense, it already gives some starting kind of position that is, more favorable. Of course, the risk for China being here that as time goes, as people have experienced certain difficulties, there are counter-narratives, this impression may fade away, and the initial optimism may kind of wither away. The question of subsidies, just really quickly, I mean, yeah, it's a socialist economy. The subsidies are there. Links between even private actors in the state will be there. The question is how we adapt. What is interesting in my research, which, as I say, I always tend to deal with normative issues, is that actually now you have acknowledgement in the West that maybe subsidies sometimes are okay. I'm not going to talk much about the U.S., where, these voices that are now gaining prominence in dealing with China, but also advising on the national greatness of the U.S., really advise for strong links between government and business. But also in Europe, you have Germany and France contemplating industrial policy on new technologies, which would focus on creating European champions with direct support and even funding from national budgets. So this is, again, we are entering a stage where what happens with economic paradigms and principles and so on. And this is what I call the indirect ideational impact of China. While others have been trying to change China, China with its enduring performance has been also has been managing to kind of change the thinking of Westerners about how to do the economy. And about the question on the infrastructure gaps, absolutely. Again, this feeds into the narrative of the competition, national interest. You mentioned the connections between Central Europe and Germany. It makes sense. German supply chains, they extend to Central Europe. The Balkans, kind of far away, periphery, no one really cares. Like if you see most of the European maps, at least until recently, Balkans was even this gray space. It was not even on the map. It was like it's under the water or something. So, of course, China is tapping into that kind of dissatisfaction. And, of course, it's a huge, huge space. We must not forget it's not only China coming with connectivity ideas. Much of the European response to China has been in the realm of connectivity, and perhaps a lot of these strategies will be revised. You have the EU-Asia connectivity, in which the Balkan EU-Asia connectivity strategy, the Balkan plays a prominent role. The U.S. is boosting its overseas private investment cooperation with the idea to counter Chinese offers and provide support for infrastructure. You have Japan, which is now becoming one of the key partners of Brussels in advancing EU-Asia connectivity, which has come with offer to the Balkans. So actually, if you have smart politicians in power in the region, they may be able to take advantage of this new situation. Okay, people are finally talking about economic development, connectivity. There are different competing offers. So it's, we can make use out of most of them. And just one quick comment. We keep on talking about this pro-China sentiment in Serbia. I really want to say there are different layers and different types of being pro-China. And I agree that in the Balkans, people tend to be really emotionally pro-China, but it's mostly because of this symbolism and this dissatisfaction. But in my own experience, the most kind of informed pro-China discourse that I've seen was not in the Balkans. It was in Duisburg, Germany. Duisburg, the biggest inland river port, where the whole city, the regional government of North Rhine-Westphalia, they're really jumping on the Belt and Road narrative, because it really means a lot for the Duisburg port and the whole city. But there, the pro-China narrative is not so much about, mere fantasies, we're going to build like waterways and so on, but it's about a very concrete, hands-on approach that they have been developing for decades in cooperation with China. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. My colleague, Berlin-based colleague, recently did a story about this in the Financial Times, if anybody wants to learn more about the port. Sorry for that PSA. Hanna, did Anastas leave you any comments that you can make?
Very well covered by both Anastas and Agnes. Maybe I can just go a little bit to the last question on transport. You're absolutely right. This is something that the EU is leaving absolutely unfulfilled in the region. If I'm not mistaken, I think there are some attempts, or at least ideas, to include the Western Balkans into this T10 network project. However, the final contours and the long-term projections are still not clear. But yeah, this is something that absolutely should be done. And then, this is where China comes into the picture, where they see the potential for where the acquisition prices are low, the human capital is very affordable in the region. There is a great need for money being lended to these countries. The concessions for the Chinese are very much simplified, and it's a great position for them to put themselves into, to have access to Central European and Western markets. So this is a win-win situation for the Chinese, and then still, we are talking and hoping that same initiatives will come from the EU-funded projects and incentives.
Thank you. Jacob, do you have anything to add? And maybe you can also compare and contrast the narrative power across the countries you visited in Eurasia.
Yeah,
Thanks.
Come back on subsidies, the gap, and maybe just mention the contract, Montenegro. So just to sort of back up what Anastas said about this systemic challenge China presents with the example of Pelješac Bridge in Croatia, which I think is worth mentioning, because that's, to me, the sort of one of the end results of this pushing Chinese companies up the value chain that I was talking about before. China Road and Bridge Corporation. They've got loads of experience in Serbia and Montenegro, and now they won this tender for the bridge, EU-funded project in Croatia, and no one's happy about it. The Austrian company Strabag, they sort of they took them to court. I was told at DG Move in Brussels that they looked at it every which way they could, and it's just not illegal. Their bid was incredibly cheap. They did nothing wrong, but that's because CRBC is sort of indirectly subsidized because it's a Chinese state-owned enterprise. They have a captive domestic market. They have grown their portfolio by all these contracts in Serbia and Montenegro through loans which are tied to contracts. So I think it is sort of as we know, the EU sort of needs this sort of reflection point to sort of see what it should do. Just on the gap, I agree. The EU should be doing more, but there's a lot of money here and generally, and I think a big part of the problem is that China's funding things that the EU can't fund and wouldn't fund. Like you mentioned, Tuzla, the energy Secretariat has sort of open proceedings against that because of state subsidies, and they don't fund lignite coal plants, and China does, and they wouldn't fund a project like the one in Montenegro because it doesn't make sort of fiscal sense. So that's a challenge China presents. And just on the sort of contract with that the Montenegrin government drew up with CRBC. It's the sort of, you read the contract and it does have these sort of things about being secured against assets, any non-military asset in Montenegro, and a load of other problems. They left off like a load of works, electricity, sort of add-on roads, which weren't in the original contract. And I was told there that it's sort of fundamentally a problem of institutional capacity. You know, they're sitting at the table opposite from CRBC, whose parent company has like a revenue 14 times the size of Montenegro's GDP. It's difficult to negotiate with these guys, and they're not going to leave you any room. They're not going to sort of be sympathetic. So I think maybe that's why Serbia is more successful, because it has this institutional capacity to deal better with Chinese companies. And just one quick thing on the appeal of China in the Balkans. I think it's very true that they don't, like Anastas was saying, they come with no baggage, as opposed to sort of Russia or the West. And I think it also sort of dovetails with this narrative of China being a sort of no-nonsense businessman who's just sort of self-interested. But at the same time, that's contrasted with the EU, which has got this sort of condescending attitude. Brussels is seen as demanding, whereas Beijing is seen as sort of, they're just looking out for themselves. But that's fine, because at least they're not telling us what to do. And I mean, I don't think this is quite sort of realized in Berlin when you talk to people. I've forgotten what your question was.
That's all right. That's good. Well, maybe just a quick follow-up. I had an interview earlier this year with Enlargement Commissioner Johannes Hahn, who said, we have not been paying enough attention to what China's doing, and we should add it to the screening process, and we should specifically look more at procurements and tenders and who's getting them and what the processes are. Would that... do you think that would be a good policy in terms of preventing maybe some of these contracts or making governments think twice about it? Or do you think it would be a continuation of the condescension that you mentioned?
I just don't think it's helpful. I think just griping about what China's doing just adds to this sort of sense that the EU is two-faced. Germany deals with China, but they're telling us not to. I just don't think it's helpful, Johannes Hahn's comments it's not helpful. What they need to be doing is sort of offering alternatives, even potentially if it means compromising on values. They need to sort of think about that, because China is a reality, and China's economic footprint here is a reality, and they need to come up with more constructive ways of dealing with that, I think. So screening, I don't think would be incredibly useful. Like I said, they can sort of help build institutional capacity, just provide, I don't know how the mechanics of it would work, but provide financial advisors, legal advisors in a sort of as non-condescending way as possible.
Thanks. Side note, the Montenegrins also took the loan, which was for 800 million euros in a dollar denomination, which has also caused, in addition to everything else, quite a lot of expense. So, do we have any more questions in the audience? Okay, wow, I see a lot of hands. Maybe we can start over here, since we started over there before. We have from here, 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 and then we can take one over there. Whew. And these are the last round of questions, so if you have something burning in your mind, use this opportunity.
Barry Snellgrove from UK. I'm former head of international projects in the Ministry of Justice, but now advise in retirement Agencia, an organisation that works in this region. I've done some work years ago in Africa, and the sort of pathways of China in Africa were to create dependency, to give these big structural grants loans, and bring their own workers, have their own work camps, their own economy, build their own hotels with their own facilities, which rely then on China to provide when they go wrong. So my first question is, how much of a dependency are we creating by taking these easier contracts? And my other point is one a bit more sensitive, and it's the C word, corruption. Signing a big contract like that for a country the size of Montenegro, which is the same size as Leeds, a northern city in England, seems really, to use a word, dodgy to me. How much individual benefit has come out of signing this contract is what I'm trying to say.
The million-dollar question. Okay, we have another question up here.
Anton Bebler from Slovenia. Nobody mentioned that China has come to the Balkans not for the first time, but for the second time. in 1960s, 1970s, China had a client state in Europe, and that client state was in the Balkans. It was Albania. This relationship of a client with the client state lasted for more than a decade. It was heavily ideologically colored or tainted. So in a way, the Belt and Road Initiative, which is not ideological, indicates that the Chinese have learned something from that their first experience of involvement in Europe and particularly in the Balkans. Would you comment anything?
Thank you. Okay, we had another question. Where did I see? Here, and then we will come to your question.
I'm David Morgan from Canada, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I guess I have something of a sort of a so what question, in the sense that when we make investment decisions, we typically take into account political and sovereign risk, and then financial risk. I'm just wondering whether we have, in some ways, lost some confidence that we're actually coming to sensible conclusions. So if we, decide, oh, crap, that's a lousy project because we just don't trust Bosnia to pay us back, or we're just not making enough money. That's how we do things. That's our system. So I guess the point is, have we lost confidence in our tried and true system? Because it won't have been the first time. We've lost confidence in the past, but I think in the end we've come back to believe that that's largely sensible, and to not ask our taxpayers to fund projects that make no financial sense. So I guess the question I'm asking is, maybe we should be asking, is China making a mistake in funding these projects that seem to be largely absurd, certainly from a purely financial perspective? And so I think it would be interesting to ask whether China is acting in its own self-interest, and whether, and if so, how is it that they have managed to do something that we haven't been able to do? And my own tentative answer to the question of why do we care is presumably one, I think you mentioned it, Jacob, or perhaps it was somebody else, that we end up with them funding things that we wish weren't funded. So the lignite, for example. So there are social costs associated with some of the stuff that they're doing that we really wish we didn't all have to absorb. Another possible answer to my question is that we care because they're enriching, this is the corruption point, they're enriching people at the expense of the social good. Private actors are reaping the benefits. So I think we should focus on what the consequences are of these investments, as opposed to just saying, holy crap, there's a lot of investments.
Thank you. We can come here, but I realized that I didn't see a hand waving in the back. So I promised this gentleman here that we could ask you. Well, okay, we'll come to you, I promise.
Excellent. Thank you. What a great panel. My name's Teresa Fallon, Center for Russia, Europe, Asia Studies. Just to follow up on that, China isn't 10 feet tall, and we know that they've misallocated a lot of goods or investments along the Belt and Road Initiative, because initially, if you said, I have a great idea for a Belt and Road project, the government just threw money at you. So there's a lot of misallocated investments. So the Chinese we call them white elephants, but the Chinese call them, or the local people call them, red elephants. And this got so bad that even Chinese bankers were not allowed to leave the country because it was assumed that they were so corrupt by, funding these bad projects. So in this region, how are the governments, to follow up on the Canadian official's question, how are you assessing risk? This is the key question. And with examples of Montenegro, all these kind of failed projects, how can the region improve their governance structures? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, and the gentleman at the end. Can we add some time to this panel? No, I'm joking.
Thank you.
We have so much to
Igor
discuss.
Tabak, defense analyst. Okay, we've been talking about roads, railroads, harbors, this kind of Belt and Road initiatives. But do they have a defense national security component? How does investing in, be it cyber defense, be it telecommunications that have dual use, maybe, does that connect investing in individual defense systems? Seeing, on the other hand, the European Union trying to do more on EU common defense and stuff, how does China play into that, against that? What would you say?
That's very interesting. Thank you, Will. And Serbia just also bought some arms from China, am I right? Shall we start again with you, Agnes? Or yes, great, please. So we have
Africa, right?
Yeah, the
Africa
dependency,
parallel?
corruption, Albania, funding, general question, misallocated funds, red elephants, and national security. Go.
Well, I don't answer all of them because there are some other smart people in the panel, but I try to start with the Africa, Central and Eastern European parallels. I don't think that it can be compared, to be honest, because one of the main reasons of the Chinese companies to come to the Central Eastern European region is that we have skilled workforce, and the price of this workforce is cheaper compared to the Western European markets. In the case of Africa, they had to bring in people because there was not available skilled workforce at that time. And in many cases, those people who built those roads and built those hotels, as you have mentioned, went home right after the project. And there were some cases when they even started to train the local people in order to be capable of building more roads and more highways. And I would like to emphasize here something which is indeed a similarity between Africa and the Western Balkans, for example. They waited for years, for decades, for other countries to help them, for other countries to build infrastructure, for example. In the case of Africa, they waited for, France, for the UK, for the US, but nothing has happened. And I think that there's an unfortunate and sad similarity in the case of the Western Balkans, because they have been waiting for so long for infrastructure investment, for different kind of support from the Western European countries or from the developed world. And since it is just a hope still, they started to open up towards other directions that I think I have to say that it is completely understandable from Western Balkan perspective. So that's at least my opinion in case of comparing Chinese in Africa and Chinese in Europe. Corruption, I think, is something that it is linked or can be linked to Chinese investment, but not definitely from Chinese point of view, but from Central and Eastern European point of view. And that is also a sad story, and that is rooted deeply in the political history of the Central and Eastern European countries. And it is rooted in the disappointment. So it was not the loss of trust, it is rather the disappointment of the Central and Eastern European region of not catching up with the developed part of the EU. And this disappointment brought these countries more open, or made these countries more open towards China, towards Russia, as they decided to diversify their strategy, both politically and both economically, in order to be able to develop. So I'm an economist focusing on development issues. That is why I think that the major here to be analyzed is not the Chinese part, but the Central and Eastern European part, because all the corruption issues are rooted in history and then in the current political and economic situation, and not the fact that Chinese are offering loans, for example, for them. Because, to be honest, for corruption cases, we don't need Chinese money. European money will suffice as well. So that's a sad story, but a true story.
Thank you very much. Anastas?
To address at least most of them. Ethiopia. Well, the first thing that comes to my mind when mentioning Ethiopia in relation to China is Ethiopian economic miracle. I don't think it's the best example of dependency, because in the last few years, Ethiopia has been growing astonishingly, and it's greatly advancing, and China has been playing an important role in that. That being said, I completely agree that there is always risk of creation of dependency, corruption, mismanagement, and so on. Of course, this raises the question of the local side, like the risk assessment that was mentioned, and so on. On the other hand, I have to say there have been cases where you had some local actors with some capacity to negotiate more or less better terms, not ideal terms. It's a learning process. Like a lot of the highways in the Balkans, for instance, are co-constructed by local subcontractors. So let's say in Macedonia, for instance, the Kičevo-Ohrid highway, the Chinese company Sinohydro is only in charge with building the tunnels, the most difficult parts of the highway. The rest is done by local companies, which is, not necessarily like the brightest example, but just a point that it's not always just about Chinese workers, Chinese companies. What you said, Agnes, there is some training programs and so on. I like very much the historical reference, though I would also say it's not only the 60s that matter for understanding the history of China and the Balkans, and not only Albania and Varoja and all that matters, but it's actually the post-78 era that matters even more. When you had so many experts that were flew in from Yugoslavia, from Hungary, from Poland, they were flown to China to show the Chinese economists how to open up, how to build a socialist market economy. And this lasted up until the early 90s, the regime change. I highly recommend, there is a recent book by Julian Gewirtz, who wrote on the influence on international economists on China's reform and opening up. Of course, he focuses here on the World Bank, IMF, and so on, but there is a large chunk of the book that is devoted on the influence of Central East European and Balkan economists in China in the 80s. Whether China is making a mistake, I mentioned something about this earlier. Of course, there is this aspect of, and the debate in China, and this also follows up on what you said about whether it's worth it for China and whether there are risks perceived in China, local actors making bad decisions and all. It's always the debate. There is one aspect that I didn't mention, though, that I think it's worth, and I think it's a very important difference in values. In China, there is always this tolerance towards trial and error. So it's there's always this idea that you can do many projects, some of them will work out, some of them will fail, some of them will be surprisingly overachieving, some of them will be disappointingly underachieving. And this worked for China, or at least it's said to be working out. I'm not sure if this can work out in smaller countries, and this is probably something that really needs to be taken seriously, because when you take such a huge loan, there's not much space for trial and error. You kind of need it to succeed. But it again raises the question of local capacities, local circumstances, the question of corruption, of course. I mean, again, back to I like your term, Jacob, enhancement drug. If there is local corruption, there is a good chance that China, but also I want to say it's not just China. You see also other external actors like buying into this kind of corrupt networks. It's kind of human behavior at the end of the day. You had in Macedonia, you had the Chinese highways that were controversial regarding corruption, but you had also EU-funded highways and highways done in cooperation with European companies that were marred by corruption. So it's kind of a part of the local landscape. The defense, national security components, I think absolutely. Belt and Road in general has a lot of that. Maybe not so much in the Balkans, but if you see like towards the Indian Ocean and towards Western Asia, South Asia, it's a lot about energy security, supply chain security, and so on. How does that, like in the Balkans, now there are debates how much the technological side of cooperation has a security component, which is, of course, very much in accordance with global debates. And it certainly is a topic to be dealt with in depth.
Thank you so much. Agnes, you just wanted to add something very quickly, right?
Just in connection with the defense perspective, which can be not only the energy connections, but also 5G networks. This is also a hot topic nowadays. And as far as I know, Huawei, for example, is here in the whole region. And not only in this region it is supported, but for example, I've just read it a few days ago that even the Germans are decided to be open up again towards Huawei. So I think that it would be from now on rather hypocrisy to be blame this region for having several type of strategic relationship with Huawei when some Western European countries can also have.
I think, I completely agree with Agnes, and I want to say, with a lot of these questions, it's also about the framing, what is security and what is not. And this is like the big debate now with regards to China, where you have, on the other hand, the impulse coming from the US, where everything is security, even like what seems most benign is security issue, and then you have, of course, dissenting views.
Thank you. I wanted to talk about Huawei and 5G as well. We can have a whole another panel on that. But let's turn to Hanna to respond to the questions from the audience.
Okay, I'll try to sum up some of the points that were raised earlier in the question part. Corruption is definitely one of the consequences of the Chinese presence in the Western Balkans. Because this economic dependency comes with political vulnerability at the same time. If we go a bit into more details about what just Anastas said, there is this great example, negative example of the corruption at a very high political level in Macedonia. There was this project in 2013. 2 highways were built in Macedonia. Both of them were, of course, financed by the Chinese loan and executed by their company. And very political, the highest political elites of Macedonia were involved. The then Prime Minister and the Minister of Transport were heard on the tape later on that they were asking for 5% commission from €500 million worth project, which resulted in 25 million euros. This is a huge amount of money, and this is one of the examples of corruption at a very high political level in the Western Balkans. And this is one out of many. I know that there are also similar examples when it comes to European projects, but this seems to be a kind of a norm when it comes to some of the Chinese. You mentioned the Pelješac Bridge, etc. So then we ask ourselves, what is the added value for the Western Balkans then? You have Chinese workers who come. At this, there were 2/3 of Chinese workers who were employed during the construction of this highway in Montenegro. All the goods are imported from China and they're VAT free. So, what is the added value for the Western Balkans then? And then, if you add corruption on top of the corruption scandals that we have anyhow, then, what is the good side of the whole story?
Well, traveling on the road if it gets built. Jacob?
Corruption, it's a massive problem. I guess this is anecdotal, but I was told that the kickback rate in Montenegro is 10%. So for $1 billion road, that's a lot of money. Obviously it's an endemic local problem, but I'd just like to push back a little bit on the idea that everyone's as complicit. I'm sure European businessmen would like to be, but I think they are somewhat limited by home rules in a way that Chinese companies aren't. It's technically against the Chinese criminal code to bribe foreign governments, but I can't imagine that ever being enforced unless it's for political reasons. And just anecdotally again, in Tajikistan, I was told that European bosses, when faced with the option of paying the tax they needed to pay or paying a smaller amount to make the tax disappear, they generally pay whereas the Chinese directors always would. Workforce, I think the Chinese companies are probably getting a bit better on that. Again, with the example of Tajikistan, I think it's 70-30 local Chinese, and I saw it was roughly that. I think they managed to, again with bribery, tilt it slightly in their favour, but I think they're getting better on that. Actually, here in the Balkans, I think they don't have as favourable ratio as in other parts of the world. Maybe because China's a newer presence and local governments haven't been pushing back as much. In terms of lost confidence. And this question of, I think that's really interesting. I think that's a reasonable conclusion to draw from this sort of perceived crisis of this sort of systemic clash. I don't know if you've heard of Bruno Maçães, who wrote the book Dawn of Eurasia. He's sort of a Portuguese European secretary turned sort of political philosopher. He's a controversial figure, but he basically envisions the Belt and Road as this sort of alternative to the West as a concept. And he sort of equates the EU with the Qing Empire or the Ottoman Empire, and his sort of declining days facing this question of whether we adapt or die. I think that's the conclusion, that we've just lost confidence and our system is fine, is one that you might be able to draw. Just one thing on red elephants. I think that's true. A lot of Belt and Road projects are sort of economically destructive rather than positive. But I think an important thing that Anastas highlights in his work is that this is a sovereign choice, and I think we need a more sophisticated response than just saying the Belt and Road is bad. Of course, governments like Rajapaksa's in Sri Lanka, they're going to sort of go for these projects, these vanity projects that aren't going to lead anywhere. But it's not enough just to say that China's the principal guilty party in this.
So we clearly need more journalists all over the region investigating what's going on. Is that a conclusion? No. Sorry. We have precisely enough time for each panelist to give 1 minute conclusions. Maybe you can take out your crystal ball. Maybe you can make some predictions for how CE and Balkan countries will be relating to China in the next 10 years. Will we be zooming around Chinese-made roads in the region? All happy? I'm running through the 4 minutes, so I will turn it over to you. But challenges and opportunities and conclusions. Mm-hmm. All in 30 seconds, 1 minute.
Okay.
Thanks.
So I think that the main challenges here for the Central and Eastern European governments, including the Western Balkan governments, how to adjust to the new situation, and maybe it is absolutely independent from what China is targeting or aiming to do here. It is rather the decision of the local governments, and maybe it is also decision of the European Union itself to somehow make the connection stronger between the Western Balkan and the EU in order to counterbalance those possibilities China or Russia or Turkey or other non-EU countries are gaining from the current situation. So maybe that is the challenge as well as the opportunity, since there is an opportunity for the more developed players here to act more responsibly.
Deadlock that's still going on in Brussels about...
So I think the next few years will be a complete reverse in dynamics of the current period. And the current period being a lot of talk, fewer results. I think in the next period you're going to see some results. Like some of these projects will be completed. You're going to see the first changes they're going to bring in the economic landscape, probably not too dramatic. But there are some changes. There are some changes in Serbia with the Smederevo steel mill, like the infrastructure project. So you're going to see that, but you're going to see much less enthusiastic talk, which will be a direct function of the developments on the Washington, D.C., Beijing, and Brussels-Beijing relations. You're going to see probably a lot more involvement of European actors and potential American actors, and certainly some other actors like Japan, I mentioned earlier, in economic development in the region, but probably not too much. Everything will be there. Like the debate will change, for sure. We're going to talk less about the things we used to talk. We're going to talk more about those things. But it will be some kind of modified status quo. I don't see any dramatic change.
Thanks. Hannah?
Let's be selective when it comes to choosing partners. And let's work on the neighborly relations first, focusing on regional cooperation, good neighborly relations, reconciliation, normalization of relations at every level. And let's put still focus on the European Union, because this is where the future of the Western Balkans lies, no matter how distant it seems at the moment.
Thank you. And a very good introduction to the next plenary panel, which is going to be about Kosovo-Serbia dialogue after the coffee break. Okay, Jacob.
I don't have a crystal ball, so I'm going to also end with a recommendation. I think Chinese interest is a great opportunity for Serbia, not in the least because it provides political leverage against other actors. But I think what the US Minister Counselor said yesterday about being clear-eyed, eyes wide open, this is important. And I think to be clear-eyed, you need to have the necessary expertise or room for critical discourse, which I don't think exists in Serbia. I think CEP, obviously BFP, and Dragana Mitrovic, an academic here, they're probably the only people who are willing to sort of speak critically on China, and everyone else, in my experience, seem to be paid by the embassy, Beijing embassy, and that's obviously not useful. I mean, whatever you think about China, you should have these sort of skills, these tools to be critical. Yeah.
Very strong, solid, and clear recommendation. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the panel. I think that they were fantastic. I think I'm the only one on stage that didn't say thank you very much to the organizers for having me, so thank you very much for inviting me. It was a great honor to be on the panel. And enjoy the coffee. I know I'm looking forward to some. Thanks.